You're on.
Well, good evening to everybody. It is great to be with you again. I consider it a great opportunity to have spoken to you a couple times. And Jane and I go back a long time. She was a student. I think, Jane, you're in a couple of my classes. I know the logic one. Was the other world religions? That's what I want to think. That's what I want to say anyway. Anyway, tonight's topic is a topic that I really enjoy. I've written a new book that should be out, God willing, will be out next April. It's published by RTB Press. Reasons to Believe has developed its own publication wing. And the new book is going to be entitled Christianity Cross-Examined. And I have a chapter on faith and reason. Are they compatible? And in that chapter, I look at 10 different ways that faith and reason go together. But tonight, I'm just going to talk about 5. And of course, looking at this image, you have a brain here. The historic Christian view is really what I would call a mind-body dualism. I think the Bible has a basic mind-body dualism. It's not the Rene Descartes type of dualism, but it is interesting that Thomas Aquinas, for example, the great Catholic philosopher, he argued that we're a union of body and soul. And he argued, interestingly, that even in the intermediate state, so that would be after death, but before the final resurrection, that we will be exist as souls apart from our body for a temporary period of time, re-enfleshed at the resurrection. But he said, interestingly, that in the intermediate state, he didn't think that we were fully human, that our fullness as human beings is a body-soul dualism, a unity of soul and spirit, if you will, or I should say body and spirit. But we're going to talk about the intellect, and we're going to talk about ways that the Christian faith is reasonable. So 5 ways historic Christianity is reasonable. And I'm going to suggest this. The thoughtful Christian stands at the intersection of faith and reason. My old friend Frank Pastore, who taught at Biola and was a Major League Baseball player, used to have a program on local radio station, and he would talk about Christians living in the intersection of faith and reason. And I like that. I think that's exactly right. I think that Christians are people of faith, but they're equally people of reason. And faith and reason are not at odds with one another, rather they go together. So you have the street signs there on the intersection of faith and reason, and I think that's pretty cool. So the question before us tonight then is the historic Christian faith a reasonable belief system? And I think the answer to that is clearly yes. That when we look at Scripture, and when we look at some of the great thinkers within Christian history, I think the answer is clearly yes. I should say that there are times where some Christians have kind of given the impression that faith and reason don't go together. I think sometimes there is kind of an unfortunate anti-intellectualism in some of our churches. But I think if you look at Christianity collectively, all of our great theologians, philosophers, apologists have seen a compatibility between faith and reason. Well, though I think faith and reason go together, and I'm going to try to illustrate that for you tonight, I think there are many people, and lots of people at the university, both students and faculty members, who actually look at faith and reason very differently. They think that faith and reason stand as faith versus reason. So many people view the faith and reason as being at odds with one another. And of course, you see the little image there. You have a telescope, and it's got its boxing gloves. And on the other side is the cross, and it's got its boxing gloves. And so faith versus reason oftentimes that is understood as science and faith are at odds with one another. Again, I don't think that that is the case, but that is the way lots of people think. And one of the roles of the Christian apologetic enterprise is to illustrate that faith and reason are not at odds with one another. Okay, well, let's expand that a little bit. I think that there are many skeptical people today, atheists, agnostics, critics of the Christian faith, and they think that, again, reflecting the faith versus reason, they would say that faith merely involves hoping something's true. That faith is about hoping that something's true, but that differs from reason in their mind. They think reason involves affirming something to be true based upon justifying evidence. So faith is hoping something's true. For them, reason is affirming something to be true based upon proper justification, or what we might say in philosophy is proper warrant. Another way of thinking of this is it faith and reason, or is it or friends or foes? So are faith and reason compatible? Are they friendly? Are they on a friendly relationship? Or are they foes? And again, according to the foes model, faith is equivalent to wishful thinking, and thus incompatible with reason. So a lot of people look at faith that way. I have to say, and this is probably something I mentioned maybe last time, I've just completed a book, and I kind of tackle some of the new atheist comments. But I think a lot of the new atheists are not terribly formidable. And I think one of the major reasons why is because they have not taken the time to study Christianity. So Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Dan Dennett, Richard Dawkins, I don't think that they've ever seriously read some of the great Christian thinkers. I doubt whether any of them have read St. Augustine or St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Anselm, just to mention some of the great Christian thinkers through the centuries. Whereas if you go back, 50, 75, maybe 100 years ago, there were atheists who knew a lot about Christianity. A.J. Ayer, for example, people like Jean-Paul Sartre, the French atheist existentialist. These are some of the, J.L. Mackie is another Oxford professor. I would call these kind of the old atheists, and they knew a lot about Christianity, and it made them formidable because they knew the strengths and the potential vulnerabilities of Christianity. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, the famous German atheist who said that God is dead. Well, Nietzsche's father was a Lutheran minister. Nietzsche knew a lot about Christianity, and I think a lot of skeptics today think that faith is wishful thinking and reason is verifying something on the basis of evidence. I think part of it is that they've really never been exposed to kind of a rigorous, thoughtful Christian perspective. And so when you're sharing your faith, when you're talking with people at the university, you may be the very first serious, thoughtful, reflective Christian that they're going to encounter. And so how you approach these issues may make a real difference for many people. So historic Christianity's view of faith and reason is very different from this popular stereotypical foes definition. And I think that that's pretty clear. So let's then look at 5 aspects of Christianity's reasonableness. And again, since the perception that the Christian faith isn't a reasonable religion persists today, it's important to examine these 5. So I'm going to call them 5 ways that historic Christianity is reasonable. And number 1, and I think that this is a very important one, the number 1 reason that faith and reason go together, that they are compatible, is that faith's definition involves reason. So if you look to Scripture, the New Testament Greek word for faith. The verb is pisteuo. We would translate that in English to believe. The noun is pistis, so we'll translate that faith. I would say that both a biblical and a historic Christian definition of faith would be this, that faith involves confident trust in a credible or a reliable source. Confident trust in a credible or reliable source. If you look at pistis or you look at pisteuo, the foundation of that word is trust. So to have faith is to put your trust and your confidence, but not just in anybody or anybody. You know, faith is not blind, it's not empty. In a New Testament context, our faith is our confident trust in what we come to know as a credible or a reliable source. A trust in God, trust in Christ, trust in the truth, trust in reason and logic, trust in maybe your parents, or trust in the very chair you're sitting in right now. I have confidence that this chair is not going to collapse. So one reason, and a very important reason, that faith and reason are compatible is that the very definition of faith involves a rational component. I have faith or trust, not just in anything, not in nothing. I have confident trust in a credible or reliable source. The disciples came to believe that Jesus Christ was worthy of their deepest faith commitment. We have good reason to believe that God exists. We have good reason to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. We have come to recognize that there's good reason to trust that Scripture is the Word of God. So faith's definition involves reason. So the root word for faith in the New Testament, which is the English word trust, but that confidence must be placed in a credible, and I'm defining credible as reasonable or a reliable source. Thus, faith's very definition includes a necessary rational element. And I think that's important for you to point out to people that you're talking with, whether these people would be skeptical, or maybe agnostic, or maybe open and interested but not sure, that the very definition of faith involves a rational source. We're not asking people to put their faith in something that lacks credibility. We think that faith is a step forward. It is a step of trust in something that we believe to be a credible and a reasonable or reliable source. So the biblical faith, again, confident trust in a credible or a reliable source. I think that helps people. I think it helps them to see that faith is not wishful thinking. Faith involves discernment. It involves an evaluation. God doesn't ask us to put our confidence in just anything or everything. There is a basis for having confidence that what we believe is true, that it's reasonable. Okay. Historic Christianity, therefore, adamantly rejects blind faith. I would define blind faith as I just put my trust in anything or everything. It's just blind. I just put it out there, hoping it's true, wishing it's true. That would be blind faith. Now, again, I do want to remind you that there have been times in church history where maybe Christians in the church have reflected an unfortunate kind of anti-intellectualism. And I do think that's unfortunate. I think there are times where we've probably mistakenly given people the impression that we're not discerning, we're not reflecting. But again, while I'll not mention this explicitly in my time with you tonight, you know, Scripture talks about discernment. John says, for example, in 1 John chapter 4, don't believe every spirit, but test the spirits. Why? Because many false prophets have gone out into the world. Acts, the book of Acts, it says that the Bereans were more noble than the Thessalonians. Why? Because the Bereans, when they heard Paul's preaching, they opened up the Hebrew Bible and checked to see if what Paul was saying is true. They're checking sources, right? In Paul's first Thessalonian, he says that, put things to the test. I think that illustrates that there are not just moral virtues in Scripture, there are also intellectual virtues. And I think it's unfortunate when the Christian church gives people the impression that we have blind faith, because I don't think that that's biblical. And I don't think it's part of the best tradition of our faith as a whole. Okay, number 2. The first one, again, the very definition of faith involves reason, confident trust in a reliable source. The second point is this, that faith involves knowledge. In Scripture, faith involves knowledge. For example, saving faith, that is to become a Christian, to have saving faith necessitates knowing historical facts about the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We believe that the Christian faith is not just a faith tradition, it's also a knowledge tradition. We're confident that the sources that we have been given in the New Testament convey reliable information about this person, Jesus of Nazareth, about the life that he lived, his healing ministry, his holiness, his extraordinary teaching, about his death, that he was put to death under the Roman authority of Pontius Pilate. I think it's N.T. Wright who says that the historical basis of Jesus being put to death under Pilate is one of the best attested truths in the ancient world. And of course, we believe that the testimony that we have received from eyewitnesses and those who knew eyewitnesses, that we have good, credible reasons to believe that Jesus is risen from the dead. The empty tomb, the various appearances, Paul says on one occasion to more than 500 people, the transformation of the apostles, the emergence of the church. So saving faith itself, to become a Christian, you have to know certain things that are true about the person of Jesus Christ. So faith isn't just willy-nilly. Faith isn't just wishful thinking. Faith involves knowledge. So in historic Christianity, faith is connected to the rational knowing process. In other words, historic Christianity constitutes a knowledge tradition. And again, I underscore that point, and I make these first 2 points right at the top because I think there are a lot of people, and again, just like the new atheists, there are a lot of people that don't have a good background about Christianity. And their thought, maybe they've got it from some Christians that they've known, or their perception. Their perception is that faith is not academically rigorous. And I think we need to convey to them that faith involves, the very definition of faith involves a rational component, confident trust in a reliable source, and that faith involves fact. It involves historical facts about the person of Jesus Christ. All right, let's move to 3. The third one is that faith is compatible with reason. And what I want to convey is that the scholarly consensus of historic Christianity, and I think that this is reflected in some of the most influential thinkers within historic Christianity. I would include St. Augustine, I would include Anselm and Aquinas. Now, all 3 of these are to one degree or another Catholic thinkers. But I think when it comes to Augustine is probably as influential to Protestants as he is to Catholic. And so Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas, they're Western Christendom thinkers. While they've influenced the Catholic Church, they've probably influenced Protestant nearly as much. And of course, you have many Christians who identify themselves as Thomists. Norman Geisler is a very good example. Southern Evangelical Seminary, some of you are familiar with the school, and in fact, some of you may have even gone there. They follow a Thomistic view. So this idea of faith and reason has been influenced in Western Christian thought. And I think probably the way to sum this up is to look at the Latin term fides quiriens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. And let me unpackage that a little bit. For Augustine and Anselm and Aquinas, and of course, I should tell you a little bit about all three of these individuals. Augustine is the most prolific author in the entire ancient world. He wrote more than 5 million words. There isn't any writer in Latin or in Greek that wrote more than St. Augustine. So you could argue that we know more about St. Augustine than anybody in the ancient world. That is, we have much of his writings, 5 million words. Great place, if you'd like to read Augustine, is to start with his book, The Confessions, which is a literary classic, a Christian classic. If you're in a Great Books program, every Great Books program includes Augustine's Confessions. Anselm, Augustine's dates are 354 to 430. Anselm is a medieval Catholic thinker. Probably you know him for the ontological argument. He is well known for developing critical thinking about Christianity in the Middle Ages. And then Thomas Aquinas, the Summa Theologica, the Summa Contra Gentilis. Aquinas is arguably, in fact, I would tell you, I have chapters on all three of these individuals in my little book, Classic Christian Thinkers. I think it's possible that Thomas Aquinas is the greatest mind in all of Christendom, maybe in all of Western civilization. He was an amazing intellectual person. But the thing that I like about Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas is this: even though they're all brilliant geniuses, they're deep people of faith. They have a very warm heart. All of them had great humility. Sometimes humility and genius don't go together, but in the case of Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas, it certainly did. Well, I think all three of them would accept that Latin expression, fides quiriens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. Now, let me tell you a little bit about that faith seeking understanding. I think that for Augustine and Anselm and Aquinas, all of them would affirm that faith is a gift of God's grace. I think all three of them would say, for example, that coming to faith is never purely a rational process. It involves reason, it involves facts, it involves evidence and evaluating all of those things, but it's never merely just an intellectual process. For Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas, all of them would say that God's Holy Spirit, third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit, our comforter, our advocate, the Spirit is at work in the heart and minds of people. And so faith is a gift. It is a gift that comes through the preaching of the gospel. Romans 10:17, faith comes by hearing the message about Christ. So in one sense, they believe that faith is a gift. It is something that comes via grace, but grace and reason are compatible. They go together. The Holy Spirit uses reasons and facts and evidence to bring about a work of grace, a work of salvation in a person's heart. But once that faith has been given, Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas would all say that Christians have a responsibility to then seek understanding. While reason in and of itself cannot cause a person to have faith, God's Spirit has to be involved in that process. That after a person is a Christian, they should seek to understand the rational underpinnings for the faith. Or the way Augustine put it was this: reason in and of itself apart from grace does not cause faith, but reason everywhere supports faith. So we should be able to discover that there are good reasons for what we believe to be true, that they really are true. All right. Thus, Christians should be interested in the rational foundations of their faith. That's what we call apologetics, that there are good reasons to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that he was the Messiah, that he rose from the dead, that the New Testament Gospels and accompanying epistles, that these are sources that are credible, reasonable. And in conjunction, the Christian apologetic enterprise works to show that there are good reasons, facts, evidence, arguments to believe in the truth claims of Christianity, so that faith and reason go together. Faith does involve developing a confident trust, but that confident trust comes to us. The Spirit uses reason and fact and evidence, so they're compatible. They're not at odds with one another. And again, lots of people think they are. Lots of people think they are, I think, because that's what they've been told. They have been given a stereotype about the way Christians believe. I mean, think of the political season that we're in. It seems like whatever political party you hold, that there are lots of people that want to paint the opposition in the worst light possible. I mean, how often do you hear a political candidate get up and say, look, I don't have any wish to run down my opponent. I think he or she is a pretty fine individual. I just think that I have better ideas. I'm not going to engage in straw man misrepresentation. I'm just going to lay out to you what I think. No, I think that we live in a political time where, unfortunately, people feel like they've got to paint their opponent in the worst light possible. I kind of wish I were, lived during the time of Abraham Lincoln, where, Lincoln would debate their opponents. Now, don't get me wrong. Politics has always been messy and dirty and difficult, but there have been times in the past where they really engaged each other in a rational way. And I think we have many critics of Christianity. Unfortunately, I don't think that they're really seriously interested in hearing some of the answers. So it's going to be part of our duty, part of our job, to engage in the apologetic enterprise and to lay out that case. To be the adult in the room, to be the person in the room who's going to look at these issues carefully and reasonably. So faith involves facts, evidence, and reason. Faith is compatible with reason. All right, let's move to number 4. We're going to look at 5. Here's number 4. Faith can't be fully comprehended by reason, but faith does no damage to reason. While faith can't be fully comprehended by reason, it doesn't do any damage to reason. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, Christian believers as finite creatures, right? We're finite, which means we have limitations and boundaries. Christian believers as finite creatures cannot fully fathom, exhaustively understand the divine mysteries of the Trinity and the Incarnation, for example. But those doctrines are revealed and defined in a way that avoids being actual logical contradictions. So, what am I saying here? Well, let's take a look at the Trinity and the Incarnation. The Trinity says that the one God exists or subsists as 3 distinct persons. So God is one in essence or being, but 3 in personhood. I'll never fully and exhaustively understand how the Trinity works. I'll never understand the Trinity the way the persons within the Godhead understand themselves. Because I'm finite and God is infinite, because I'm a temporal creature and God is an eternal creature, I'm never going to fully and exhaustively figure God out. And if I do, you'll know that he's not much of a God, because I am a finite individual. So everything that we know about God involves mystery. Uh, I think two of the greatest mysteries are, again, the Trinity and the Incarnation, but creation is mysterious. Salvation is mysterious. The attributes of God, the sovereignty of God, the freedom of human beings, everything that we know about God, because God is infinite, because God is eternal, is going to involve mystery. But I repeat again, Christian believers as finite creatures cannot fully fathom or exhaustively understand the divine mysteries of the Trinity and the Incarnation, but those doctrines are revealed and defined in a way that avoid being actual logical contradictions. Let me show you what I mean. Little bit of a logic lesson. A contradiction is in logic is when two statements negate or deny one another. We say, for example, that the law of non-contradiction says two statements can't be true that negate or deny one another. A cannot equal A, and at the same time and in the same way equal non-A. So sometimes people go to the Trinity and they say, hey, this has got to be a contradiction. You're saying God's one and he's not one. He's three and he's not three. That's A and non-A. Well, again, what's interesting when you start studying the church fathers and you study the church councils, you begin to appreciate the fact that our great statements of faith were put together by people who respected equally the mysteries of the faith, but also the laws of logic. And so, for example, the triune God's oneness, that's God's essence, is in a different respect from his threeness. That's in his personhood, thus avoiding the violation of the law of non-contradiction. A thing A cannot equal A and equal non-A at the same time and in the same respect. The Trinity would be a contradiction if we said that while God is one, he's not one. It would be a contradiction if we said in the same way that God is three, he's not three. But that's not what the Christian church, that's not what Christian theology teaches about the Trinity. We say the way in which God is one, in his essence or being, is different the way in which God is three. That has to do with God's personhood. And you've probably heard Christian philosophers talk about one what and three whos. What is God? Well, God's monotheistic. There's only one divine being. But the three persons share fully and equally that one divine essence. So again, the Christian fathers who developed the creeds, who set forth the church councils, and again, the doctrine of the Trinity and the Incarnation were challenged. You know, during the Arian heresy, you have Athanasius battling against the Arians. The Arians, their Christology is very similar to Jehovah's Witnesses. They argued that Jesus was a creature. The Father had created Jesus, and then through Jesus created everything else. So Jesus wasn't fully divine. So the church debated the question of the deity of Christ. There were heresies that challenged the Trinity. Modalism, maybe the Father, Son, and Spirit just change personalities, right? Or tritheism. It's very similar to what you find in the Latter-day Saints. So these heresies, they never go away. Modalism, Sabellianism is found in the Oneness Pentecostals. That's not the Assembly of God. That's a distinct body, the Oneness group. And tritheism, as I mentioned, is found in the Latter-day Saints. Arianism is found in Jehovah's Witnesses. And so again, we're reminded of the Apostle John. Don't believe every spirit. Test the spirits. Why? Because many false prophets have come out. But when the church fathers debated these issues rigorously, they respected two things. They respected the mystery of divine revelation, but they also respected reason and rationality. And when you look at the creeds, when you look at the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Creed of Athanasius, the Athanasian Creed, or the Creed of Chalcedon that looks at the two natures of Christ, the Church Fathers were very careful to pay attention to divine revelation and reason and rationality. They saw them both as gifts of God. So you can define the Trinity in a way that avoids the logical contradiction. Now, that doesn't mean that we have figured out the Trinity. That doesn't mean that the Trinity isn't still challenging. And it doesn't mean that anybody has a perfect, complete, and exhaustive understanding of the Trinity, but we can state the Trinity in a way that is consistent with reason and that we have a basic understanding of. And again, these are doctrines that have to be handled carefully. Let's look at the Trinity, for example. Again, our statement in 4, faith can't be fully comprehended by reason, but faith doesn't do any damage to reason. So the triune God is one what? That's what is God? That's God's essence, his being. And 3 whose? 3 persons. And so God's personhood is different than his essence. God's who, the who of God, is different than the what of God. And so we say 1 and 3 in different or in distinct ways. And so here is a little image illustration. Notice that in the middle you have God. The Father is God, looking within the triangle. The Son is God. The Holy Spirit is God. All 3 distinct persons share equally and fully the one divine essence. So the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are all fully and equally God. There is no subordination in terms of nature. But notice on the outside, the triangle, the Father is not the Son is not the Spirit, the Father is not the Spirit. So they are distinct persons, but they all share the one divine essence. And again, revelation from God isn't simple. I mean, we're talking about God after all. This is an infinite, eternal being. This is the creator of all things. And so the doctrine of the Trinity is challenging because we're talking about the very nature of God himself. But I think our point here is a very important one. We can't fully figure God out. We cannot exhaustively understand God. But that doesn't mean that our theology, it doesn't mean that our faith or the mysteries of our faith somehow clash with reason. They can be stated in a way that retain their mystery, but don't violate the laws of reason and rationality. Well, let's also then take just a brief look at the doctrine of the incarnation. And I mention these two because these are 2 of the greatest mysteries. And they're right at the heart of our faith. I don't think that you can be a historic Christian and deny the Trinity. You can be a Christian and not understand the Trinity, because I think all of us fit into that camp. But if you deny the doctrine of the Trinity, I think you are outside of the Christian faith. If you deny the incarnation, and so carne comes from the Latin carnivore, right? A carnivore is a animal that eats flesh. The Greek word for flesh is sarx in the New Testament. The incarnation, God coming into the flesh. So the second person of the Trinity took a human nature and became man. And so Christians understand Jesus to be both God and man. He's a single person, but he has both a divine and human nature. And the early Greek Christians entitled Jesus the God-man, the theanthropos, theos, where we get the word theology is God. Anthropos, anthropology means man. Jesus is the God-man. So the incarnation involves, now we'll contrast this with the Trinity. In the Trinity, we have one what and three who's, but in the incarnation, it involves two distinct whats and one who. So take a look at our little image there. Notice we have a triangle, and the reason why Christians have gravitated toward a triangle is a triangle does illustrate something important that we can relate to the Trinity. The triangle represents oneness and threeness. There's one distinct triangle, right? But 3 points. That isn't a perfect analogy. In fact, there is no perfect analogy to compare to God, but a triangle will at least show you that you can have both oneness and threeness at the same time. So you have the divine nature represented within the triangle. The Father, the Son, and the Spirit, they all share that one divine nature. The Father is not greater in essence than the Son. The Father and the Son are not greater in essence than the Spirit. They all share the one divine nature. They're all fully God. They're all fully equal. You could say Jesus is subordinate in that he becomes into the world and does the will of the Father. But notice there's a little circle on the left side of the triangle where the Son. So the Son has a divine nature, which makes him God. The Son shares the one divine nature with the Father and the Spirit. But notice the circle. He also has a human nature. So Jesus is one person with two natures. He's two whats and one who. And so again, the early Christians realized, wow, this is tough stuff. How can a single person have two distinct natures? Let me take a sip of water. How can a single person have two natures? Well, again, the early Christians who battled the Arian heresy and developed the church councils, they recognize that we have to pay very careful attention to what God has revealed to us in his word. We'll call these mysteries, but we also have to have deep respect for reason, because if something really is irrational, if something does violate the law of non-contradiction, then it is absurd. And if it is absurd, it can't be true. But again, I want to underscore for you that the fathers of our faith, and I think that we need to appreciate them, just as we appreciate our pastors today, just as we appreciate maybe some of the professors that we've had, we appreciate them for their godliness, we appreciate them for their intellect, their study. God has blessed the church of 2,000 years with many great defenders of the faith. And they respected two things. They knew they were being presented with revelation from God in the Trinity and the Incarnation. They were being taught deep, profound truths that were mysterious. But they also recognized that if this revelation was contradictory, it would be false. And I think they give us I think we should be grateful for the people that have come before us and the things that we can learn. So in Christ's two natures, he has a divine nature and a human nature. Christ's two natures, his divinity and humanity, they neither mingle nor negate one another. So the divinity doesn't divinize the humanity, and the humanity doesn't drag down the divinity. And so if you read the Creed of Chalcedon, just type in the Creed of Chalcedon on Google and it'll pop up there for you. It says that the two natures of Christ, they don't mingle and they don't negate one another. And again, that tells us that the church fathers who developed this, they recognized the laws of logic. They recognized the importance of reasoning. They were familiar with the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, the law of identity. Now, I wish that a lot of Christianity's critics and skeptics, I wish they had a greater appreciation for people like Augustine and Anselm and Aquinas, William Lane Craig, J.P. Moreland, uh, many Christian thinkers, Hugh Ross, people that I've known who have spent their life uh, getting the very best education that possible and then rigorously thinking through the Christian faith. I think if more people appreciated it, and by the way, I think the old atheists did. I think Nietzsche realized, if you're going to challenge Christianity, you're going to have to take on some Christian philosophers. I think A.J. Ayer understood that. J.L. Mackie understood that. Unfortunately, I don't think Richard Dawkins does appreciate it. Maybe he's coming to appreciate it. I noticed that he didn't want to debate William Lane Craig, and he's smart not to. I think Craig would have taken apart his ideas. So the reason I say that is when you talk to people about the faith on the college campus or anywhere else, in your family, people you go to school with, you may be the very first Christian they've ever talked to who thinks deeply and carefully and critically about your faith. And I think that you can model for them. I mean, one thing that I try to communicate when I talk with non-Christians is that I'm a serious person and I take truth very seriously. If I make a mistake, I'll admit it. And I try to handle truth very, very carefully. And I think that kind of intellectual role model goes a long way. And so you may be the role models for many people that you encounter. All right, let's move to 5. Our 5th and final point is this, that God's rational mind grounds human reason. I mean, where did the laws of logic come from? Where did mathematics come from? Last night I was reading a little bit about Pythagoras. Pythagoras lives just before Aristotle and Plato. Pythagoras, who you've probably heard of the Pythagorean theorem. Well, Pythagoras was a Greek thinker, and he came to understand that the universe must be composed of both moral and numerical relationships. Now, I think that's kind of staggering because in the last 300 years, science has essentially said that the way we can understand the universe is through the language of mathematics. In fact, Einstein said that very thing, that the language of the universe is mathematics. Well, here's a guy who lives 500 years before the birth of Christ, and he's speculating. I mean, he doesn't have a telescope. He doesn't have a microscope. He's simply reflecting about the nature of reality, and he comes to the conclusion that somehow the cosmos is made up of numerical relationships. I wouldn't have minded studying under Pythagoras. I mean, he was a very bright mind. But see, that then raises the question, why are human beings capable of understanding reason and rationality? Why is it only the species of human beings that develops the natural sciences? I watch these National Geographic programs, and you have scientists out on ships out in the ocean, and they come up to these sharks or these dolphins, and they put a little clip on them because they want to study their patterns, and they want to try to ensure that these animal species do not go extinct. And I was remarking to my wife, I said, human beings are so different. We actually are caretakers of the earth that we live on. The Bible is actually true. We have taken dominion over nature. I mean, we try to figure out what's going on with all these wildfires in California. How do we solve that solution? How do we work through these kinds of things? Well, how is it possible if there's no God? if God doesn't exist, and if there's no mind behind the universe, and we have evolved from purely natural processes, where did mind come from? Where did our reasoning capacity come from? If it didn't come from an infinite divine mind, where did it come from? Well, number 5, God's rational mind grounds human reason. God's rational mind, evident in the intelligent created order. The Greek word nomos, law, the Greek word logos, logic, makes knowledge, reason, and truth possible. All humankind being created in the image of God guarantees that humans have the capacities to reason and discover truth. And if we take a look here, God in effect networked the comprehensible cosmos and rationally capable human beings together with himself to allow for a congruence of intelligibility. Thus, in historic Christianity, the rationality of the universe has a reliable metaphysical ground. I mean, think about it in very simple terms if we can. Let's suppose there is no mind behind the universe. There's no intelligence behind the universe. So there's no teleology. Well, where did reason, rationality, and knowledge come from? And how can we have mind, and how can we have personhood and rationality that we can look back at the universe and understand it in a way that it cannot? I personally think it is a very challenging thing for an atheist to ask themselves, how did I get reason? How did I get morality? And how did I get meaning? Did reason come from the non-rational? Did personhood come from the non-personal? Did mind come from the mindless? And if it did, then maybe the process of evolution is more of a miracle than we ever thought. But of course, from a Christian point of view, from a biblical view, a Judeo-Christian view, if you will, God is an infinite, eternal being. God has an infinite mind. He understands all things. He possesses all knowledge. And when he created the world, he fused into that world nomos, laws, and logos, logic. And when God created us, he created us in his image. So he has an infinite mind. He created creatures with finite minds, but he networked us together. And so this idea, and there are a lot of scientists these days, by the way, and not just religious ones, there's some very secular scientists who have come to believe in what we would call human exceptionalism. In human exceptionalism essentially says that when compared to the animals, humans are different, not just in degree, but in kind. It's not simply that humans have similar things to the great apes, for example, but we have more of it. There are both secular and Christian scientists who would say that humans really are different in kind. They're exceptional creatures. And it relates to things like our intelligence. It relates to things like our speech capacities. It relates to things like our ability to engage the natural environment. And of course, I would equate, and I think plenty of Christians would follow suit, that human exceptionalism fits really well with the image of God. That the reason why we're different, not just in degree, but different kind of being, is that we have unique rational capacities. We have unique intellectual capacities, moral capacities, spiritual capacities. And, one of the philosophers and educators that I admire is Mortimer Adler. Mortimer Adler was the editor at the Encyclopedia Britannica. He is the editor of the Great Books of the Western World. Adler affirmed this idea of human exceptionalism. He would often say that humans are different, not in degree. And I think I think degree would be the given position of evolution. I think Darwin thought there was an incrementalism. The species would differ from each other, but only in degree. Um, but I think clearly one of the ways in which we're different is our language skills, our ability to blend sounds together to convey ideas. We call that reading. And so one of the things that makes humans exceptional is our thinking ability, our reading ability, our conceptual ability. And Mortimer Adler would say, for example, that symbolism, if you will, that unique symbolism that humans possess that is different than the bipedal primates, the Neanderthals, and other very intelligent creatures to some degree. Adler would say that symbolism, that reading, writing, thinking ability is the thing that puts us in the exceptional camp, that puts us in the difference in kind than in degree. But Adler says this: most human beings have mastered basic reading skills by the time they're 7 years old. Humans really are exceptional. And I think it's both in a good sense and in a potentially not so good sense. Human beings have developed the natural sciences. Human beings have been able to put a man on the moon. Human beings are in the process of developing medications that will counteract COVID-19. From what I hear, it's moving ahead pretty quick pace. But I probably don't have to remind you that 75 years ago, you have Auschwitz. We're an advanced country, Germany, one of the most advanced countries in the world, is taken over by a totalitarian political force, and they make public policy the extermination of the race of the Jews. If you don't believe in original sin, read the anonymous comments on the web. You'll see the dark hearts of people. Humans are, as Blaise Pascal, who's one of the great founding fathers of science and one of the great Christian apologists, Pascal said human beings are an enigma, a riddle, a puzzle of greatness and wretchedness. Greatness because of the image of God. Wretchedness because Genesis 3, the fall. We have been given a fallen nature from Adam. And so God is that rational. He is the one that grounds our rationality. All right, because historic Christianity is a rational belief system, many Christians have made great contributions in the rational fields of logic and science. Let's look at this fairly briefly. Many of the advancements in the study of logic over the centuries have come from the work of Christian-oriented scientists. In fact, the logic textbook I use at Biola University, when Jane was in my class, we used the Concise Introduction to Logic. Well, in that book, Patrick Hurley, who is a contemporary philosopher, he taught at San Diego University, which is a Catholic school down in San Diego. In his book, and I thoroughly recommend this book, I used it when I was studying logic as a college student in the early 1980s, and I use it today. In that book, A Concise Introduction to Logic, he has what he calls 10 eminent logicians. First, the first eminent logician is Aristotle, who we call the father of logic. Aristotle certainly wasn't the first person to think logically, but he was the first person to kind of develop and systematize principles of reasoning. And he did a lot to contribute toward the development toward science. He was interested in fossils, he was interested in biology, etc. Well, it's interesting that the 10 eminent logicians that Pat Hurley mentions in A Concise Introduction to Logic, which, by the way, is the most used logic book in the United States. 10 eminent logicians, 6 of them have deep connections to historic Christianity. Here they are: Peter Abelard, William of Ockham. Have you ever heard of Occam's razor? Occam was a medieval Christian thinker. Gottfried Leibniz. I'll bet some of you have heard of Leibniz's cosmological argument. George Boole. You might have heard of Boolean logic. How about John Venn? Ever heard of a Venn diagram? Kurt Gödel, who was both a scientist and a logician. So here's an interesting thing. I'm reading through this concise introduction to logic. I come across the 10 eminent logicians, and 6 of them are Christian-oriented scholars. Well, if Christianity is this anti-intellectual religion, if faith and reason are totally apart, if they're at war with one another, why is it that there have been so many unique contributions to logic made by Christians? That's an argument I think you can make with the non-Christian who is critical of Christianity. Wait a second, if you think Christianity is anti-intellectual, are you aware of the great contributions made by so many Christian thinkers? And if Christians don't respect reason, why are they making so many contributions to logic and reason? All right. I also want to say something about science, because logic and science are 2 of the most rigorous intellectual disciplines we have. The intellectual climate that gave rise to modern science roughly 3 centuries ago was shaped decisively by the Christian worldview. You have what we call science's founding fathers: Faraday, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, Boyle, Pascal, on and on. There certainly were Jewish scientists who made unique contribution. It's also the case in the Enlightenment. You have the earliest part of the Enlightenment is more religious, the latter part is more secular, but Christianity has a unique influence on what we call the scientific revolution right around the middle of the 16th century, the middle of the 1600s in Europe. It's true that the Greeks and the Romans made contributions to science and math. It's true that other civilizations, the Chinese, the Mesopotamians, even the Islamic population and developed algebra, but science began one time, and it began in Europe, and the shaping worldview of the time was Christian theism. So the biblical worldview provides a basis for science to both emerge and flourish. The scientific method depends on many critical underlying assumptions or beliefs that science itself cannot validate. If a scientist is to go about his or her work with confidence, they must, for instance, believe such profound presuppositions as the following. To engage in science, one of the assumptions is that the objective reality of the cosmos, that there's a real world out there. In Hindu philosophy, it's an illusion. But in Christianity, God created a real world. It's real, it's good. Another assumption, the basic intelligibility of the cosmos. I mean, you have the agnostic physicist Paul Davies. And Davies says one of the most peculiar things about the world is that the world is intelligible. It is basically understandable by human beings. Why should it be intelligible? Why is it an organized cosmos rather than chaos? But then why should human beings have the ability to track the intelligibility? Well, if we're made in the image of God, God networked us together. Another assumption, the order, regularity, and uniformity of nature. How could we have a world without order, regularity, and uniformity? But of course, scientists don't know all about the universe, but the assumption, the presumption is that that nature reflects an order, a regularity, and a uniformity. Another assumption, the reliable effectiveness of mathematics and logic to describe the cosmos. I mean, I was reading an article by a physicist named Wigner, 1960, and he said that the fact that we can develop mathematical understanding about nature is a miracle. Now, of course, he was a naturalist. He didn't mean a supernatural miracle, but he said that it's just inexplicable that human beings can develop mathematical framework that actually corresponds to the phenomena of the world. That Einstein could develop equations that would actually correspond to the natural world. Wigner says, that's a miracle. Of course, I would ask, how is that possible? Why is that possible? Well, if God exists, and if God has networked the world, and if numbers and propositions and sets flow from the mind of God, that seems reasonable. What are some of the other assumptions of science? The basic reliability of human cognitive faculties and sensory organs. That just means that your brain and your eyes and ears, your nose, that they all function pretty well, and we can engage as observers. We can engage in the scientific process. Our mind is not something that causes illusion. It's not perfect, but it is reliable enough to create the natural sciences. Another assumption, the congruence between the human mind and physical reality. Again, that if there's no God and no mind behind the universe, why should we ever think it would be possible that the human brain would evolve to a place where we could have consciousness, and that consciousness could then understand the natural world? I think it's much more believable, much more reasonable, much more coherent to think that there is a mind behind the universe and he networked the world. In fact, most people who have ever lived on planet Earth have believed that God is just common sense. But of course, we know biblically that sin affects the way we look at the world, and grace is very important. Another assumption, that acceptable criteria for an adequate hypothesis exists. This is a complex idea. We think there's a way of developing a hypothesis that then we can go out and test, verify, or falsify. And then finally, that what is observed in nature can provide clues and indications of unobservable patterns and processes. That simply means the things that we can uncover by science may help us uncover things that we cannot directly observe. But all of these underlying assumptions, they're worldview assumptions. These are not things that we can prove strictly. They're assumptions that we begin with. And so science is remarkable, but there are things that science can't do. It has limitations. The point I'm making here is these assumptions that are so critical to the development of science, they fit really well into the Judeo-Christian worldview. They're not an easy fit for naturalism. They're not an easy fit for Buddhism and Hindu worldviews. And so why did Christianity have a big influence on science? The founding fathers were Christian. The basic assumptions of science were easily derived from the Judeo-Christian scriptures. Here are two amazing books. The one on the left, The Genesis of Science, subtitle, How the Christian Middle Ages Launched the Scientific Revolution. So when I talk and dialogue and debate with critics of Christianity who think that Christianity is not very reasonable, I say, well, you know, where did all that intellectual firepower that birthed the scientific revolution in the 1600s, where did it come from? I'll tell you where it came from. It came from the medieval Christian universities, like Oxford, like Cambridge, like the University of Paris. The other medieval schools were developing the natural sciences. So if Christianity and if Christian faith is incompatible with reason, why did the scientific revolution, why was it birthed by the Christian university system of Europe? On the book on the right, The Universe That Discovered Itself, Robert D. Barrow. Take a look at that book and look at the assumptions. Here is a scientist who looks at the scientific process and points out these assumptions. And again, those assumptions fit really nicely in the Christian worldview. So let's just summarize our 5 points here. Number one, faith's definition involves reason, confident trust, not in just any source, but a reasonable, reliable, credible source. Two, faith involves knowledge. To have faith in Jesus, you have to know things about him. You have to know factual things about him. Three, faith is compatible with reason. They fit together, they work together. Four, faith can't be fully comprehended by reason, but faith does no damage to reason. We see that in the Trinity and the Incarnation. And then finally, God's rational mind grounds human reason. Reason has to come from somewhere. And I think that the secular world, I think they struggle in trying to provide a foundation for reason, for morality, and for a sense of meaning or hope. But I think Christianity provides all of those things amazingly well. So where do we stand? I think the thoughtful Christian stands at the intersection of faith and reason. I like that. I'd like my house to be right on the corner of faith and reason. And here's 2 books where I write about some of the things that I've talked about. I have a new book that goes into more depth. Again, Lord willing, my new book will be out in April, and we've come up with the title Christianity Cross-Examined. But my book, without a doubt, and my book, A World of Difference, has arguments about logic, about ethics, about science. And Jane, I'm going to stop there. And I'm hoping that maybe we can have a little time of question and hear some comments. So I'll stop my presentation and I'll give you the floor there.
Yeah, so if anybody has a question, you could just go ahead and unmute your mic and ask it. Well, if you have any questions for them, nobody's asking questions.
Well, I do have a question. Kind of like last time, I ask you what you think are some of the big challenges. Let me ask you this: what do you think? What do you think are the biggest challenges when non-Christians relate faith and reason together? What kinds of issues come up when you do that kind of thing?
Anybody? Guess everybody was just listening today. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. Yeah. When you talk to people, let's say you're talking to people in your family, maybe people you go to school with, you work with. When people think about faith, what's the struggle that they have? Where is the challenge in their mind between faith and reason? Or I'll put it maybe even more simply, how do non-Christians understand faith? What do they think faith is?
Certainly they think it's blind.
Okay.
That it's not measurable. See, I think that they would go to a doctor because the doctor can measure results.
Right.
And they don't think that we have access to that kind of knowledge.
So to put it maybe that science can make statements that can then be potentially verified or falsified, but Christians make statements that just kind of hang out there and there's no way to test them?
Yes.
And I think that's where I think that perception is the way lots of people think. And I think that's where we need to be able to talk with them and say, look, the beliefs of Christianity match historical statements of fact. The Christian faith is a confidence and a trust in a reliable and a reasonable source. And that's where I think we can then talk about the truth of Christianity, the resurrection. I think that's where we can talk about.
Well, they would probably go anecdotal on you and say something like, we prayed for my mom to get better. Didn't happen, she died, whereas so-and-so's mom got chemo and she lived.
And we might be able to say something like this. First, we might relate empathetically to their condition, right? We care about them and we care about their family members. But we may be able to say something like this, that, you know, the science and technology that has led to, you know, very good results for human beings. Maybe, you know, if you're born in 1900 and you were a white male, your life expectancy was 45 years. Today, if you're born and you're a woman, and let's say you're a Seventh-day Adventist, you might double the 45. And part of that has to do with science and technology. But then I want to tell you a story. Where did the development of science and technology come from? It's deeply rooted in the Christian worldview, and the assumptions of science fit well with the Christian worldview. I think we can communicate to them. I think what we can say is, look, you trust in science, you trust in logic. Lots of the development in those very rigorous disciplines are grounded deeply in Christian history.
Well, what I heard was that the Catholic Church didn't believe Galileo, and they suppressed all of the science coming out of the astronomy realm. What else did the church suppress? That maybe we could be 1,000 years ahead if we didn't have the Dark Ages and Christianity.
And of course they do say things like that, but of course a lot of times they misunderstand the Galileo affair. They don't realize, for example, that when the church thought that the Earth was at the center of the solar system, they really were trusting Greek philosophy, in particular Aristotle. They don't recognize that Galileo was a very committed Christian. Galileo was a very committed Roman Catholic. He wasn't arrested. I think one thing, and I think it relates, and I'm really glad you raised this point, because I think it helps us to illustrate something. I think, for example, when we look at the political season that we're in, just like people in political parties often try to present their opponents in the worst light possible, a lot of times people read Christian history and church history in the worst light possible, and we're taught those things by people who are vociferously critical of Christianity. So it does mean we may have to do some study. We may have to be able to unpackage a little bit, and hey, let's, you love science and you have a lot of confidence in science. Well, when did the scientific revolution take place? What was the circumstances of the development of science? And by the way, the Catholic Church, with all of its troubles and challenges and difficulties, the medieval monks in the Middle Ages, they preserved manuscripts. They preserved civilization, and the Catholics helped with the development of science. They helped with the development of learning. The Protestant Reformation encouraged learning. So in some ways, as you have accurately said, there are a lot of critical people today that have perceptions, but I think we have to be able to move in and maybe help correct some of those perceptions. I would say, and I'll take you again if I could. I'm not sure you can see my screen again, but I take you back to that book, The Genesis of Science. That book is very powerful in illustrating that science and Christianity, for the most part, have not been enemies. They have been friends. So those are some of the issues. I think we have to talk, we have to develop, we have to present our ideas and our arguments. How about some other, is there any other questions, ideas on your mind?
Well, to answer your question, Ken, I've heard the perspective that Christianity is just kind of a crutch for people who need something to believe in, people who can't stand up for themselves, people who are weak. And I've heard a lot of people say, "Oh, I'm fine. My life is going great. I've got good grades, or I've got a great job, a great wife, a great family. I'm doing fine. I don't need Christianity."
Yeah. Yeah. Shannon, I think you're right. I mean, I think a lot of people, feel that way. And I think what's interesting is they look at Christianity as, I'm not sure it's something I need, right? Things are going pretty well. I got a good job, got a good family, I'm healthy.
Yeah, how's it going to improve my life?
Yeah, okay, so they're looking at it, it's like, is this something I want to purchase? Is this something that I want to buy? Is it something that I need? Of course, they haven't asked the truth question, have they? They haven't asked, well, what if Jesus actually rose from the dead? What if there is credible evidence that Jesus was crucified, and then 3 days later he was alive again? They've asked the question, is that something I need? I'm not sure I need that. What do I need, God? Why do I need a God telling me how to live my life? But I would just simply first say, so you're not asking whether it's true. You're asking whether I need it. Now, of course, there are a lot of other people who would say something very different. For example, I would tell you, when I understood the message of Christianity, I immediately realized, man, I need that. I am a broken, fallen individual. I need, and when I began reading the New Testament and I recognized the kind of person Jesus was, the things he said, the things that he did, I realized I need that. I want that. So you're going to have people on both sides of that. Maybe some people would say, what do I need it for? Other people are going to say, I want it. But again, it's not addressing the truth question. I mean, if Jesus did rise from the dead, I think everybody in your life and my life, they need to know that. Just down the street from me, there's a cemetery. And someday they're going to take me to that cemetery, and they're going to take you. If Jesus rose from the dead, whether you think you need him or not, if it's true, maybe it's something you want to listen to.
So they're going to see that as a claim, an unknowable claim, a truth claim.
It's definitely a truth claim. And if they have questions about its credibility, if they have questions about whether it can be carefully evaluated, whether it's a credible claim, then we can step in and try to help them. We can talk about manuscripts. We can talk about history. We can talk about a factual relationship. I have proposed, I would put it to you this way. I think there are a lot of people who have lives where it's very clear that they do need God. I mean, during the pandemic, the numbers of suicides have gone up. For a lot of people, Even the best, I mean, I'll be perfectly candid. I think if you live in the West, if you live in Europe, some of the higher socioeconomic countries of Europe or in America, you probably have one of the best lifestyles you could possibly have. If you live in Africa, if you live in India and other places, you live in some of the totalitarian Islamic countries, your life is not all that good. But there are a lot of people here in America who have a very good quality of life, but they don't have despair overcomes their will to live. So I think some people know they need God. There are other people who need some convincing.
Yeah, I think that's why relationships are so important, because I think oftentimes people take apologetics and think you could just argue on spot and, save souls. But from my experience, it's always been a long, long process.
I completely agree. I think we can plant seeds. I think we can water. I think relationships mean a great deal. I don't think there's any bulletproof argument. I haven't come across an argument that works every time on the spot. Apologetics is sometimes a down and dirty. But you know what? If you're the first thoughtful, reflective Christian person they've ever known, and if they see in you that you care about truth, you're careful with how you handle information and knowledge, and if you communicate to them that, you know what, in my belief system, you have value and you have dignity because you're a creature that God made, and I care about you. I think those are very, very profound things that we can leave with people.
Are we kind of, I guess there's no easy way around it. I mean, are we kind of stuck into a one-on-one, long-term relationship, friendship, mentoring type of discipleship situation? I mean, how do we get this message out? How do we combat against, mass media coming against us, constantly being bombarded with anti-Christian rhetoric?
It's a very good question, and not a question I think that's easy to answer. I mean, again, I've spent most of my adult life reading philosophy, history, theology, but like you, I hear people say things. They pitch Christianity in the worst light possible. I'll take an example of the Supreme Court. They look at a nominee, and they may want to put that person's life in the very worst possible way that it can be presented. That's not easy, but the way I think we should look at it is, I think Christian people need to be involved. If you think that Christianity is not being given a fair shake by media and by journalism, then I think some Christians need to go into the media and journalism world and help change things. I think I think that politicians are often more interested in power than they are in truth, then I think some Christians need to go into the political world and try to change some of those things. I think if you think that there are science departments or philosophy departments that don't give Christianity a fair shake, then I think Christians should enter into those fields and to try to make a difference. I don't think that we should give up. When I look at Christian history, I think there are times in church history where Christianity is moving like a freight train. I mean, it's coming, it's influencing, it's changing the world. And then there are other times where it looks like we're stuck. We're just, we're knocked down. Culture's going to, culture is being corrupted. And I think if you look at church history, and by the way, I think St. Augustine said that in his famous book, The City of God, that if you look at Christian history, there are sometimes the church is advancing and sometimes it's declining. Sometimes we're winning and sometimes we're losing. But I don't think the way of combating these things is by withdrawing from culture. I think we need to roll up our sleeves, and if we don't think we're getting a fair shake, then I have a friend who is he's a screenwriter, and he's written a couple movies that I think are just amazing. And he tells me stories about how much money and influence and how difficult the movie business is. But this guy has been able to put together some movies that they have redemptive themes in them. They're movies that really challenge you. And I think we're living a pretty tough time. I mean, if you would have told me 10 years ago that same-sex marriage would be the law in all of the United States, if you would have told me that 10 years ago, I'd say no way. Now, let me ask you a rather fearful question. What might happen in the next 10 years?
Depending on where this election goes.
Well, there you go. And I think, of course, now Christians have differing ideas. Sometimes people look at the world and they say, well, the Lord's going to come pretty soon. So, maybe we should put all of our energy into evangelism, maybe not so much trying to change the culture, because it looks like the culture is just moving in the wrong direction. But of course, there have been times in church history where they've said that. I mean, could I tell you that my parents, who were World War II parents, who lived through the Depression and lived through a world war where 70 million people were killed, I think my parents probably had more reason to believe that the church was stuck and the culture was dead than we do. For example, one of the largest Christian countries in the world is China. India is moving in positive directions. It's true, Europe and America might be declining, but I think that's the point Augustine's making, that maybe we should see the history of our faith is it's always going to be moving up or moving back, winning, losing. But I don't think the thing that we can do is to give it up. And if you think journalists are not being fair, if you think they have biases, then maybe you need to encourage your friends who are Christians to go into that field. And you know what? It may involve you going into politics. My friend Kevin Lewis, who teaches at Biola, his brother is the mayor of La Mirada, and I couldn't be happier. He's thoughtful, he's reflective, he's hardworking. I think we need to roll up our sleeves. Now, when the Lord's going to come, only the Lord knows. But I would encourage you that if you see a field where you think that the faith is not being given a fair shake, what can you do about it? And again, I think Ratio Christi is a very valuable ministry. I think it's a very valuable apologetic ministry. We live at a time where there is a lot of secularism on the college campus. We live at a time where there's a lot of postmodern thinking. We live at a time where instead of thinking through the prism of truth, goodness, and beauty, we get heavy doses of race, gender, and class. I think Ratio Christi is in a very good position to talk about ideas, to challenge things, and I support Ratio Christi. I think the ideas at the university slowly and gradually always filter down to the society. And I think often where the action is on the college campus. A lot of the ideas that we're seeing in society today, they've been percolating for 50 or 75 years in the universities of the European world. So I don't want you to give up. I don't want you to be discouraged. You know, I grew up in a nominal Catholic family. And I was a sophomore in college. And my brother, who was a hippie, he was older than me. He'd always had kind of psychological challenges, became addicted to narcotics, and then he was arrested and was incarcerated for a long period. And despair overcame my brother and he took his own life. And I remember I was only 19 at the time. I was just starting college. And I'd never had anybody close to me die before. And I felt so bad because I felt like I had not been able to help my brother. And my sister, my older sister, had become a Christian. And she gave me a book entitled Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And it sat on my sat in my room for a long time, and then one day I picked it up and I started reading it. And I was really struck that, wow, how could a Christian be so careful, so thoughtful, so reasonable? I felt like Lewis wasn't trying to push me, or I felt like he was just kind of laying out a perspective. And Lewis has a comment in his book, The Problem of Pain. He says, it's my favorite, I think it's my favorite Lewis quote of all time. He says, God whispers in our pleasures. He speaks in our conscience, but he shouts in our pain. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Well, in the suicide of my brother, I heard the shout of God. And it brought me to my knees, and I thought, I don't have any answer. I had no answers to give my brother. And I don't have many answers even for myself. And I felt like I was flat on my back, but when I was flat on my back, I looked up and I saw and I heard the loving voice of God. I heard God's voice. And the Lord transformed me. And even during the difficult times, the painful times, the Lord is at work. And I noticed when Jane was a student that she was thoughtful. I noticed immediately that she was careful. And I encouraged Jane. I said, you might consider Ratio Christi. And Jane, you've been working in Ratio Christi for a number of years now, and you're influencing people. And all of you who have been influenced by Jane, you're going to be influencing other people. So I want to encourage you. I think what you're doing, I mean, to me, it's an honor to be able to speak to you, to encourage you. And I want to encourage you, if you see things in culture and society that you think are convoluted, that are unfair, if you think there are areas where you think Christianity is being misunderstood, I would just simply ask you, what can you do about it? I'd like to meet journalists who would just simply say, look, I'm going to report the truth. I'm going to be careful about my biases, my prejudices. I'm going to make sure I don't say things unless I can defend them. I'm going to assume the best in other people. I'm not going to paint people in the worst light possible. This, of course, is what I would call the golden rule of apologetics. Treat other people's ideas the way you want yours treated. Doesn't mean you accept what other people say, but it means that you're respectful to them. It means you get their ideas right. It means you're fair-minded in the way you handle them. So, yeah, I think there are real challenges in the world in which we live. But again, let me remind you, I think my parents, their generation, wow, can you imagine a world depression? When Hitler took over in Germany, the rate of exchange, the monetary rate of exchange, at one point was 4 billion German marks for one American dollar. There was runaway inflation, then a world war. There have been a lot of times when history hasn't been friendly to people, but um, don't give up. And also don't think that you have to be perfect or you have to know everything in order to be able to communicate your faith. You can show love and concern. You can tell people, hey, I care about you. And the reason I care about you is my faith tells me that a loving God has created us all in his image. And regardless of your skin color, your sex, your class, your health, your standing, all people have inherent dignity and moral worth. And I think that's a message that was very attractive in the ancient world. The two largest groups to join Christianity immediately were slaves and women. And I think the reason is clear because in the Roman world, women and slaves, they had virtually nothing. And you hear the message of this carpenter from Galilee who says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. I mean, that's a powerful message. And I remember the first time I read the New Testament, I just couldn't believe who this Jesus was. I couldn't believe the things that he would say, the things that he would do. And I concluded then something that I still believe today. I think the only reasonable explanation about who Jesus was is that he really is the Son of God. And that's when I stopped wanting to be a professional athlete, and I decided that I wanted to dedicate my life to Christian ministry, to Christian scholarship. And you can do a lot of good. You can do a lot of good. There are a lot of hurting people right now. Share with them your own pains, share with them your own struggles, and share with them how the Lord has met you and how he meets your needs. And I can tell you, I've read a lot about the Buddha and about Krishna and about Confucius and about Muhammad, and there are good things about all of those individuals, but none of them ever said, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Jesus is the Son of God, and he can give all of us what we need. So I want you to hang in there. I want you to be strong. COVID-19 is not going to last forever, but there's a lot of people that they need your encouragement. They need your insight. They need friends like you. They need coworkers. They need family workers. There are a lot of people that are hurting. And ask the Lord to use you. And, the more credible you are, you don't have to know all the science, all the philosophy. You don't have to know all the history and logic, but you can be very careful with what you do know and communicate it. You can do a lot of good. And so I want you to keep it up. Jane, I'm proud of you. And I believe in Ratio Christi, and Reasons to Believe is a very good friend of the Ratio Christi campus ministry. In many ways, you're doing things that the old Campus Crusade and the old InterVarsity used to do. And, I want to encourage you. Put your trust in the Lord and ask him to show you the things that he wants you to do. And it's been a great pleasure. I've been able to speak to you 3 times, and I've enjoyed each and every time. So thank you for hearing me and hearing my heart.
Well, thank you for
Thank
all
you
that
so much, Ken.
encouragement.
Appreciate it.
You bet. God bless you, and take good care. I hope to see you again soon.
Hope so. Thanks, Ken. Bye-bye.
All right.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.